Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about brothers and sisters. How has it been being all cooped up in your house with your brothers and sisters? Are you all getting along? I want to show you a picture of my brother and my sister. This is my brother Aaron and my sister Tammy. I'm the oldest, but if you would have seen us when we were growing up, it might have looked a little bit like this. Now that's just a joke photo. We're not really fighting. We just took a little play photo. But sometimes when I was little, I didn't get along with my brother very much. And sometimes it's really hard to live with our brothers and sisters. Now, that's definitely true for the person in our story today. So, yes, last week we learned about Abraham. Remember Abraham? This is a picture of Abraham's lineage. So Abraham had his son Isaac. And then Isaac had two sons named Esau and Jacob. Now, God changed Jacob's name to Israel, just the way he changed Abram's name to Abraham. He changed Jacob's name to Israel. And Israel, or Jacob, had 12 sons. Can you imagine having 11 brothers that you had to live with? Well, down at the bottom, you will see the name Joseph, because Joseph is the second to the last born. And he's the one who our story is about today. And we are going to find out about Jacob in Genesis 37. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because Joseph had been born to him when he was old. Israel made him a beautiful robe, and Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, so they hated Joseph. They couldn't even speak one kind word to him. Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to the dream I had. We were tying up bundles of grain out in the field, and suddenly my bundles stood straight up, and your bundles gathered around my bundle and bowed down to it." And his brothers said to him, "Do you plan to be a king over us? Will you really rule over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dream. They didn't like what he had said. Joseph said to his brothers, "Listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brother, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this matter in mind. So what do you think of Joseph so far? He seems kind of like a show-off a little bit, doesn't he? And his brothers really do not like it. So we're going to see as we start the next part that sometimes Joseph's father also used Joseph to be a tattletale on his brothers when they were not doing what they were supposed to do. And that made his brothers like him even less. His brothers weren't really nice people either. They were kind of bullies. Have you ever been bullied? That can be kind of scary. Let's keep reading in Genesis 37. Joseph's brothers had gone to take care of their father's flocks. And Israel said to Joseph, "Go to your brothers and see how they're doing, and also see how the flocks are doing, and then come back and tell me." See, he's asking him to be like a tattletale. So Joseph went to look for his brothers. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to one another. "Come on, let's kill him. Let's throw him into one of the empty wells and say that a wild animal ate him up. And then we'll see whether or not his dreams come true." Reuben heard them, and he said, "Don't spill any of his blood. You can throw him into the empty well here in the desert, but don't harm him." Reuben was hoping that he could come back later and take him to his father. Now Joseph was wearing his beautiful robe. They took it away from him and threw him into the well, and they saw some traders who were on their way to Egypt. Judah said, "Come, let's sell him to the traders. Let's not harm him ourselves. After all, he is our brother. He is our own flesh and blood." And Judah's brothers agreed with him. When the merchant came by, his brother pulled Joseph up out of the well and sold him for 20 shekels of silver. And then they got Jacob's robe, and they slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the beautiful robe back to their father, and they said, "Look, we found this. Examine it and see whether it's your son's robe." Israel, his father, recognized it and said, "Oh, This is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned his son for many days. All of his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will mourn until I join my son in the grave." And so his father wept for him. Meanwhile, traders sold Joseph to Egypt, to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Do you ever get mad at your brothers and sisters? I used to get mad at my brother, but I never wanted to sell him into slavery. That's a terrible, terrible situation. And throughout Joseph's life, he's going to go through some really hard situations where he's not going to understand what God is going through. Being sold into slavery is terrible. But it reminds me of our memory verse for this week, which is 2 Corinthians 5:7. And it says, we live by faith, not by sight. And that means we can't always see what God is doing in a situation. But we have to have faith that God knows what the future is, and God is working for our good, even when it doesn't seem like it. So let's keep reading. Now we're jumping to Genesis 39. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian, who was Pharaoh's captain of the guard, bought him. The Lord was with Joseph, and so he prospered. He lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Now Potiphar put him in charge of his whole household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. And the blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except for the food he ate. So we see that Joseph is a slave, and he's in a terrible situation, and still God is blessing him. And sometimes we're in bad situations, but God can still bless us in those situations. Now, while Joseph is a slave for Potiphar, something bad happens. His wife tells a lie about him and gets him into trouble. So let's read about what happened. She told this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me and tried to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his coat here beside me and ran out of the house." When the master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him, and he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Now, Joseph is in jail for something he didn't even do. Somebody lied about him. So that's even worse than being a slave. But do you remember about at the beginning of the story how Joseph had these dreams and started to interpret dreams? Well, that was Joseph's special gift, and he is about to interpret two people's dreams. I'm just going to focus on one person's dream just because of the length of the story. We are in Genesis 40 now. Joseph said, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer said, "In my dream I saw a vine with 3 branches, and as soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even though I have done nothing to deserve being put in this dungeon." Now the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all of his officials, and he restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot about him. Can you believe that? Here Joseph is waiting in prison for the cupbearer to tell Pharaoh about him, and he forgets all about him. In fact, he has to sit in prison for 2 more years. That's like 2 whole grades in school. Think how long that is. That's a long time. Let's keep reading. 2 years passed, and Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile, and out of the river came 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. And after them, 7 ugly and gaunt cows came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. The ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Pharaoh had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. And after them, 7 other grains sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled. So he sent for the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told him the dream, but no one could interpret them for him. The chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh imprisoned me, and I had a dream. And a young Hebrew was there, and I told him the dream, and he interpreted it for me. Things turned out exactly the way he interpreted them, and I was restored to my position." So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." So Joseph said, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good grains, heads of grain, are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that come up after are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them, and then all of the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and famine will ravage the land. The abundance of the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms, because the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. Let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man to put in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You will be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So let's talk about a famine for just a little bit. A famine is when no rain falls, and when no rain falls, no grass grows, no vegetables grow, no grain grows. And they don't have Dillons where they can just run and go get food. And they don't have like an extensive food network where they can get food from other countries. If you don't grow the food that year, you don't eat. And also, your animals can't eat either. So any of the cows that give you milk, or any of the hens that give you eggs, or anything like that, they die too, because they have no food to eat. Now, if a famine happens for 1 year, it is a very bad thing. But if a famine happens for 7 long years, That is a terrible thing because all of your food runs out in the first year and you still have 6 more years to go. So God had warned Pharaoh that this was coming, and now Joseph was put in charge. Let's see what happens. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He traveled throughout Egypt, and during the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. That's a lot. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands too, but in the whole land of Egypt there was still food. All the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. Now when Jacob, who's also named Israel, learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we can live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So now you see that Benjamin is the favorite son instead of Joseph, and he won't let him go with the other brothers. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all the people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down with their faces to the ground. Do you remember the dream about the stalks of grain bowing down to Joseph? His dream is coming true. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. Now remember, Joseph has been gone for years and years. He's spent 2 or 3 years in prison. He probably was a slave for 2 years, and then the 7 years of famine happened. So he left Israel when he was just a child, and now it's like 12 to 15 years later. So he's a grown man. He's like almost 40 years old, and his brothers don't recognize him. They have no idea that this is Joseph. Joseph pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." And although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. Joseph remembered his dreams about them, and he said, "You are spies. You have come to see where the land is unprotected." "No, no, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man, and your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," Joseph said. "You have come to see where the land is unprotected." And they replied, "Your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man, who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is with him now, and one is no more." Oh, they're talking about Joseph. Joseph said, "This is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you won't leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother, and the rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you're telling the truth. And if you're not, surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them in custody for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph said, "If you're honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in the prison while the rest of you go and take the grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me so that your words can be verified." And they said to each other, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we wouldn't listen, and so now this distress has come on us." They didn't understand that Joseph could understand them because he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then he came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes, and he gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to put each man's silver back in his sack, to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done, they loaded their grain on the donkeys and left. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw the silver in the mouth of his sack. My silver has been returned, he said to the brothers, and their hearts sank. They turned to each other trembling and said, What is this that God has done to us? When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, and they said, The man who is Lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying the land. But we said to him, We are honest men. We are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of one father. One who is no more, and the youngest one is now with our father in Canaan. Then the man who is Lord over the land said, This is how I will know if you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me. Take food to your starving households. Bring your youngest brother to me, so I'll know that you're not spies. As they were emptying out their sacks, there in each man's sack was the pouch of silver. And when they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said, You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Jacob. You want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me. Reuben said to the father, You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring Benjamin back to you. Entrust Benjamin to my care, and I will bring him back. But Jacob said, My son will not go down with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey while you are taking, you will bring my gray hair down to the grave in sorrow. So some time passed in between, and they ate up all the grain that they had, and still nothing was growing in the land. It was the second year of the famine. Let's keep reading. Now the famine was still severe in the land. So when they had eaten all the grain they brought from Egypt, their father said, Go back and buy us a little more food. And Judah said, The man warned us solemnly, You will not see my face again unless your brother is with you. If you will send your brother along with us, we will go down and buy food for us. But if you will not send him, we cannot go down, because the man said to us, You will not see my face again unless your brother is with you. Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once. Then the father Israel said, If it must be, then do this. Put some of the best products of the land in your bags and take them down to the man as a gift. A little balm, a little honey, some spices, some myrrh, some pistachio nuts and almonds. Double the amount of silver with you, for you must return the silver that was put into your sacks. Perhaps it was just a mistake. So the men took the gifts and doubled the amount of silver, and Benjamin also. And they hurried down to Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with him, he said to the steward of the house, Take these men to my house and slaughter an animal and prepare a meal. We're going to eat. They're going to eat with me at noon. The man did as Joseph told him, and he took the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were frightened when they were taken to Joseph's house. They thought, Maybe we're brought here because of the silver that was put back in our sacks for the first time. Maybe he wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys. They're feeling very guilty, aren't they? When Joseph came home, they presented to him the gifts that they had brought into the house, the balm, the honey, the pistachio nuts, the almonds. And they bowed down before him to the ground. He asked them how they were, and then he said, How is your aged father you told me about? Is he still living? And they replied, Your servant, our father, is still alive and well. And they sit down to dinner. And when the portions were served to them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's, and they feasted and drank freely with him. Now Joseph gave these instructions to the steward of his house. Fill the men's sack with as much food as they can carry. Put each man's silver into the mouth of the sack, and then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver for his grain. And he did as Joseph said. As morning dawned, the men were sent on their way with their donkeys. They had not gone far from the city when Joseph said to his steward, Go after those men at once, and when you catch up with them, say to them, Why have you repaid good with evil? When they caught up with them, they said to him, If any of your servants is found to have it, the cup from the master, he will die. and the rest of us will be the Lord's slaves." "Very well then," he said, "let it be as you say. Who is ever found to have the cup will become my slaves, and the rest of you will be free from blame." Each one lowered their sack to the ground and opened it, and the steward proceeded to search, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest. Well, the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, and at this they tore their clothes, and then they loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. Joseph was still in the house when Judah and his brothers came in. They threw themselves on the ground before him, and Joseph said to them, "Why have you done this?" "What can we say, my lord?" Judah replied. "What can we say? How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my lord's slaves, we ourselves and the one who was found to have the cup." Then Judah went up to him and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord. Let me speak a word to you. Do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself. If my father, whose life is closely bound with the young boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to the father. If I do not bring him back, I will bear the blame all my life. Now please let your servant remain here as your slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? Do not let me see the misery that would come on my father." Joseph could no longer control himself. Before all of the attendants, he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into slavery. Don't be distressed or be angry with yourselves for selling me, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to save your lives by great deliverance." So they went up out of Egypt, and they came to their father in the land of Canaan. And they told him, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is the ruler of all of Egypt." Now Jacob, Israel, was stunned, and he said, "My son Joseph is alive. I will go and see him before I die." So Israel set out with all that was his, and God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here am I," said Jacob. "I am God, the God of your fathers," he said. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you and surely bring you back again." When they returned, Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brother with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your fathers and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if any of you among them has a special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." So Joseph settled his fathers and his brothers in Egypt, and he gave them the property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramesses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brother and his father's household with food according to the number of their children. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family, and he lived 110 years. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you out of this land to the land he promised on an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and our father Jacob." So Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." I don't think that Joseph had any idea that his bones were going to rest in Egypt for 400 years, but they did. For 400 years, the Israelites lived in Egypt. But when they left Egypt, which we're going to talk about next week, they took Joseph's bones with them back to the Promised Land. And because Joseph knew that he was going back to the Promised Land, because he believed the covenant that God had made with Abraham, that they wouldn't live in Egypt forever, that they would go back to the promised land. That is why Joseph is remembered in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith. The verse that talks about him is Hebrews 11:22. It says, "By faith Joseph, when his end was near, he spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones." You know, Joseph didn't know what was coming his whole life. Who would have imagined all the things that Joseph went through? But God knew. And that is why Joseph lived by the verse that is our memory verse this week. We walk by faith, not by sight. Joseph didn't know when he was taken as a slave that he would go to prison. When he was in prison, he didn't know that he would work for Pharaoh. But he trusted in God, and he always gave God the glory when he had his dreams and when he was working for Pharaoh. And because of that, God blessed him. I love this story because it's a great story of forgiveness. And forgiveness is really hard sometimes, but it's very important. So our craft for today is making a woven heart like this. And the reason why I made this craft like this is because when you love someone, whether it is a friend or whether it is someone in your family, a brother or sister, your hearts are sort of woven together. But then when you fight, your hearts are torn apart like this. And only forgiveness will weave them back together. So let's talk about how to make this. In your folder, you had two pieces of paper, a red paper and a white paper. And they both kind of look like this, okay? So all you have to do is you have to cut out your two pieces. They're long like this, okay? Okay? Then you fold them in half and you cut along the center lines. I found when I was doing this, I needed to cut just a little tiny bit farther than the black lines so that it would weave a little bit easier. On both the red and the white, cut all the way up on the lines. Now, put the red, put that in your left hand, put the white in your right hand. That way the verse will read right, okay? And you just start to weave the different pieces, okay? So I'm going to take my first piece and I'm going to go, I didn't cut very well. I'm going to go in and out and in and out and pull it all the way to the top. Now I'm going to take my second piece and go in and out and in and out. You know, this weaving is a little bit hard, but you know, forgiveness is a little bit hard as well. Sometimes the brothers, what they did was a terrible thing. What they did didn't really deserve forgiveness because that was an evil thing. Trying to sell their brother into slavery because they were so jealous of him, that was not a good thing. That was a terrible thing. But Joseph realized that God had, there's a verse in Genesis 50 that says, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." And that's how he was able to forgive his brothers, because he saw that God had planned this, that God was working in all of it, and that he had brought Joseph to Egypt so that his family would not die of starvation during the famine. He was able to weave his hearts back together with his brothers. He was able to forgive his brothers and live with his brothers for the rest of his life, provide food for his brothers for the rest of his life. If he had kept anger in his heart, his brothers would have died of starvation. But he realized that God worked through him and that God used him to save the lives of not just his brothers, but his brothers' wives and their children. And through Joseph, because he was willing to let God use him like that, God was able to build Israel into the nation that he promised Abraham. If Joseph had not forgiven, there would be no nation of Israel. They would have died of the famine. But he did what God told him. So I'm going to weave together this other heart for you, just so you can see one more time. left hand red, right hand white. And you just go in and out, in and out. Just the way we weave our lives together. We weave the heart together. The verse that's on our heart says, if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will forgive you also. That's also part of the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer says, forgive us our debts or our sins, our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Meaning, God, we know that we do wrong and sin against you. Please forgive us, and we will forgive other people as well. That's one of the promises that we say when we say the Lord's Prayer. I think it would be a good way to end our segment today is if we said the Lord's Prayer together. So bow your heads. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. I'll see you next week. Next week, our story is about Moses. We'll see you then.